So I'm gonna start off with a question for y'all, and then make sure to drop your questions in the chat, or let me know that you want to ask a question. But Matty, Paula, both of you have wonderful books right here. I dropped links where you can buy them in the chat. They're your debut
Go, drop the
collections of
plug.
poetry. Yeah. They're your debut collections of poetry, and I want to know. What you learned most writing this collection, and kind of what challenges you're seeking to like chase down for your next collection.
I learned it costs a lot of money to submit to contests. It does. There were 2 separate rounds for me. One after I finished my MFA, and then when no one picked up my book, I just sort of gave up. And then, I don't know, could continue to write. And then, yeah, a couple of sort of like reception into a PhD and did it again. I don't know, that's not really a good answer. I'm sure you were looking for something wiser, and but we'll throw it to Matty. Matty can give us the more intelligent answer. I was just like, yeah, money was what I learned, that I have very little of it. Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to have a negative answer. I mean, I'm very happy to have a book in the world, but I will, yeah, I think you always I did dream, and I was very excited to have a book come out, but you don't really know the challenges of getting people to try to read it, because poetry is very well read, as we know. And so that was a bit of a hustle and a challenge. I think I learned a lot about kind of how presses operate, which is helpful, very practical things, I guess. And I also learned that I write very slowly, and I took a very long break after this book. I don't know, I think it just took a lot of the book is kind of like an elegy for my mother, or about grappling with queerness. So it's really, really upper poems, obviously. So I just think it was a little bit of, I needed a little rest after this experience, to be frank. But I appreciate writing more now, having taken that break and then seeing the 2 or 3 people that have read my book. It's nice that
There's a lot more than that, Matty. But I was thinking also too, first books are their own species of book, because I think, I don't know if this is across the board, but I think first books often span a greater amount of years than a lot of other, and than second books, because yeah, I don't know, I feel like there are poems in this collection that are, God, over a decade old, or at least began over a decade ago. So I think one thing I learned, if we're thinking on the level of craft, not just the publishing sort of lesson, right? That it's okay for the operating metaphor, for the operating conceit or the theme to come later, and I think that's what happened with me. I think it's until you start putting it together and you start sort of realizing what themes you're obsessing about, you don't really have a full collection, until that sort of idea sort of emerges from your obsessions. It won't really sort of hold together, and sometimes that operating logic or that overall structure doesn't come until later. Does that make sense?
That absolutely made sense. But there was a second part to my question. What's going to happen for your second book? Tell us what to look forward to.
Well, when I have it, I'll let you know. But no, I've been writing a lot more about kind of hunger and the insatiable, and kind of attempting to explode the pastoral. So I've been reading more of the pastoral, which is in some ways interesting and in some ways quite arduous. But yeah, I don't know. I think my next collection will sadly be less accessible because I'm in a program that is quite theory heavy, and everything I'm writing is like a little dense at this point. So we'll maybe try to like loosen it up a little bit.
I was just gonna say, like, JP did wasn't your dissertation on the pastoral? Sorry, yeah. You're in this square, so he's nodding. But
I haven't seen him in months, and like I'm just like.
I haven't seen anybody. I'm a little bit like giddy because they're like humans on my, and I'm just like, wow, hey, you guys are alive. The second book, man, if I ever get through my mountain of grading, I might be able to actually write like a full sentence. I think. I don't know, everything feels just sort of like under the surface right now. But I think I'll keep sort of exploring. I'll keep exploring like the essay form, just because I feel drawn to it these days. And I'll keep exploring other aspects of nostalgia. Yeah.
Thank you for the teasers. I'm really excited for your upcoming collections. There's some wonderful questions in the chat. This one's for Matty. How did the canopy sequence begin for you?
I love trees. It's kind of like the primary metaphor of my book, of the first. And I think I was just doing a lot of research around trees. And kind of came upon this idea. And I actually just saw this week on Facebook, like the National Park Service even like posted about canopy shyness and canopy disengagement. And I was like, maybe I should just go work for the National Park Service. But I don't know, I like to use for some of my poems like science as like an organizing metaphor for either a poem or the sequence, because sometimes like I can't really come up with that on my own. So I think that was something for the first couple poems in that sequence that was very divorced from the pandemic. And now I think what's coming and related to them is definitely threads into a little bit this separation and this kind of disengagement that we all have, at least physically right now.
Thank you. I'm really excited to hear when poets work with science, because that's like all over my head. This question's for Paula and Matty. Tell us about your writing process. Where does a poem usually begin for each of you?
Usually, I journal and am constantly sort of writing. And when I journal, I don't journal like the events of my day. I usually sort of empty out my brain and jot down lines and snippets and thoughts. So a poem most often begins for me as a line or a phrase or an image that just sort of like, if it's sort of like sticky enough, like I can keep working with it, or if I'm like in a particular mood, and I'll have a line and I sort of like am immersed in, I don't know, whatever sense of doom or whatever sense of like, sometimes it's joy. There's actually rare moments when I do write about joy. But yeah, a phrase or is usually the beginning of that. And I just kind of write myself into a few lines, and then I leave it, and then I come back to it, and I leave it, and I come back to it. And somehow, maybe days, weeks, or even months down the line, I beat it into a poem.
Love it. Yeah. Show the page who's boss, Paula. I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes I might think of something funny or absurd, and I'm like, do I need to write this down, or do I just need to like say this to a friend? And most of the time I just say it to a friend, especially if it's maybe not super PC. And other times, if I think other people might like it, I'll write it. I'll write it down. But I also, similar to Paula, generally start with kind of a moment or a phrase and more recently kind of like paradoxes have been interesting to me. Just these absurd moments that make no sense, or like the paradox of desire in particular, I think I've been interested in lately. But I don't journal. I should journal. And now I'm inspired to journal by Paula.
So you said something really interesting, Matty. Paradox of desire. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. We're opening up Pandora's box right now. Well, I just wrote an essay.
You got some citations?
Yeah, just call some Carson and move on, you know.
Paradox of desire. I mean, most recently I was working on an essay that is kind of like conflating and imagining porn and like actual like sexual experiences. And what about porn or other erotic texts or images kind of allure us? And do we attempt to perform that performance in our own experience, or are we looking for something different in that? I won't say intimacy, but I think that that might be too generous for what my essay was writing about. But in those kind of those sexual desires or needs in some ways. So most recently, that was the paradox I was thinking of. But also, I mean, like even genres of poetry like have their own paradoxes, like the confinement, but also like the liberation of form and rhyme, for example, could be like in the Glory Hole poem, I guess. Like it's not really a classy poem, but it's a sonnet. So come at me, world.
Totally classy. It's like the classiest. It's right up there. You should.
I'm so glad I followed up on that. I feel like that question was actually a good segue to the next question, which is Paula and Matty. Matty and Paula. You each write about eros and its affects/effects, which is to say intimacy, desire, guilt, shame, though rarely satisfaction. Paula, you work in persona at times. Matty, you often work in conceit. One of my favorite lines ever. Oh shoot, I don't know if there's actually a question, but it might be. Oh, it is. I'm so sorry. One of my favorite lines ever comes from Bob Hass. Longing, we say, because desire is full of endless distances. Will you tell me about your respective modes of distancing? Whoa.
It's good, huh?
Question, JP. I would have loved you to send that to us like 2 hours ago.
I know. Yeah, give us 72 hours so we can write you our comps paper on that question. Yeah, it's you know, I'm actually teaching my students about intimacy and point of view, and you know, and for them to sort of be more conscious or mindful of the decisions that they're making about how close they want their audience or their reader to be, right? And so I'm always sort of like pulling, you know, these ideas about like desire and distance and all these kind of like theoretical ideas and trying to translate them like pedagogically. Because one, I think it helps me write more honestly. And you know, and it helps me sort of like speed up like the filtering and shedding process of all my own sort of like cutenesses that I'm like initially enamored with when I'm writing a poem. You know, like I write and I'm just like, oh man, this is good. I'm like, this line is gonna sound so good. I'm gonna read it, and then I have to sort of like come back to it and be like, no, actually that's actually shit. Like I need to get rid of that line. And but anyway, so intimacy, I think, is you know, at least with some of the poems that I am trying to write, or some of the newer pieces that I'm working on, is yeah, something I think about, and I think like desire is actually the antithesis of intimacy. In which like desire, like well Matty was saying, like, you know, the paradox of desire, right? Like the paradox of desire is that it necessitates distance, it necessitates separation, severance, and two entirely, like it necessitates the obstacle keeping two people apart, right? So that's the paradox. And so intimacy is that distance collapsed. And I think on a very sort of practical level, what that means is sort of trusting your reader to both negotiate or navigate whatever difficulty that you are struggling with in the words, but also not, you know, I don't know how to say it. Like, I want to write like more plainly, but I also want to, I don't want to be so plain as to preach or to be didactic. And I feel like intimacy is that sort of really beautiful, but also totally, what's elusive thing, right? Like, how can I reach my reader, but still sort of contain or sustain the prickliness or difficulty of whatever thought I'm trying to communicate.
Paula, I love that you said that intimacy like collapses that distance. I completely agree. And I'm always kind of, and more recently I'm striving for maybe like an intimacy with language, maybe even an intimacy with like the self. I feel like I often use conceit and a lot of veiled imagery. One, because I don't necessarily feel like sharing every detail, though my mode is, I would say, confessional to some extent. Like I don't want to put it all out there. And I think that distance that you create allows your reader to read themselves into a work and have some ambiguity in which there's connection there, but it's not overwhelmed by you, the writer's experience. And so that's, I think, one side of it. But the idea of collapsing that distance for intimacy is something I'm definitely interested in and striving for. And one thing I would add to the list, for me especially, like a lot of my writing since I started MFA, I mean fairly recently, just like 5 years ago, has been like processing trauma. And a lot of my interest in writing and art is like more like communal processing of trauma and like celebration of one another. And so like when you're navigating trauma along with like guilt and shame and desire, I think there needs to be some distance there. I mean, for yourself as a writer to sustain yourself. And also if you ever want to read the work in public.
That's really beautiful and accurate, I think. Like, you know, distance as this as a generosity, right? Like you are sort of writing distance into the work so the reader can find themselves in it, instead of like distance to sort of hold your reader apart. Yeah, I haven't thought of it that way, but I really like that.